everyone. Welcome to episode 224 of the Book Cougars, two middle-aged women on the hunt for a good read. I'm Emily.
And I'm Chris.
That's kind of a fun number to be the last episode of the year.
224, the last one in 2024.
Yeah, let's go play the lottery.
Right? Oh my gosh. Well, we have an abundance of riches in our friends that we have made through this podcast. And we just want to give a really warm thank you to all of you who've joined our Patreon community, who've made purchases through our affiliates like Libro FM and bookshop.org, people who've connected with us on social media or email. We just appreciate your support so much. We love this community of readers who've come together.
We appreciate you all. Thank you so much for making our lives richer too. Speaking of our lives, Chris, we silently passed over our 8th anniversary in December. You know, we were going to host a big party at the Ritz-Carlton, but then we decided to just stay home and read. Seriously, we've been doing this together for 8 years, and it's our pleasure, and we love that there are so many people who love to read and listen to people talking about reading. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Chris, we have some things we're going to do before we start talking about our normal segments, right?
Yes, we were going to let folks know that we are once again doing the listener top 10s. We have a spreadsheet form ready for you to fill out if you would like to. You just put in the author's first name, last name, and the title of the book. That's all you have to do.
Super easy. The only hard part is coming up with your top 10, as we all know.
That is the hard part,
and reminder, it's just your top 10 for that moment when you're filling out the form. Don't feel too much pressure. They don't have to be books that were published in 2024, just books that you read in 2024.
Yeah, fiction, nonfiction.
Young adult, it doesn't matter. The Gentleman Caller's son Liam has put together this form for us that generates a really cool top 10 list of your top 10s. So we'll be talking about that in a future episode. We have already received some questions about whether Russell Gray from Ink and Paper blog will be joining us in January to do our annual top 10 episode. Yes, he will. We're very excited about that. I'm not sure when we'll share the listener top 10s. I don't know if we'll do it that same day.
Yeah, we'll have to see how everything's coming in. Yeah. But our next episode, the 225, will be our top 10 episode with Russell of Ink and Paper blog.
Right. We kind of have an attitude here about when people start talking about their top 10s before the year is out. We like to give you until December 31st or even January 1st. Mm-hmm. Maybe we'll put a deadline of some kind on it so people will know. But for now, the link will be in the show notes. Think about your top 10s and share them with us. We'd love to know.
Yeah, it's always so much fun to see. And then sorting that spreadsheet in all different sorts of ways, like what author was read the most, how many classics show up on the list. It's a lot of fun to play around with.
It is.
Another thing that we were going to talk about is our romance wrap-up and how we did with our bingo cards and what we learned about ourselves and the romance genre over the last 12 months.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun for me to reflect on. I tidied up my bingo card first and was surprised at how many romances I read this year. And what I did, and I don't know if this was the intention of the bingo card, but I kind of made all my romances fit somewhere in a square, you know, so I changed some of them. I think I even made up a category called romance in uniform, and I made up climate romance, which I don't think was one of our subgenres. And then I also made up one called food forward romance. But I filled it all out. How about you?
Well, I did score a bingo. My first bingo card, I kind of mutilated because I started letting one book fill in other squares. And then I thought, I don't know if I want to do that. So I started a new bingo card where I only have one book per square, including our quarterly picks. They are only on one square, even though they could easily cross it into other squares. But I read more romance than I thought I did. I didn't read as much as I hoped to because I have a nice stack of romance that I've purchased over this year that I intend to keep reading in the genre for sure. But I read, what did I read? Like 10 or 11 novels, I think. And then we read the one nonfiction.
The advisory guide.
Oh my gosh. Oh, now that's one I forgot about. I was thinking about Black Love Matters.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So we have that nonfiction collection of essays and then the ALA advisory guide that you just mentioned. I loved reading through this genre. It was really eye-opening for me in terms of what I enjoy and books that people would recommend to me, and then what I didn't particularly enjoy about certain books. So I think now I have a little bit more of an idea when I walk into a dedicated romance bookstore on how to browse more effectively for myself. But that's not to say I don't want to keep challenging myself either.
Yes, and read some things that might be out of your comfort zone or what you would normally be drawn towards, you mean? Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, one thing that in an overarching way has been fun to watch this year is as we've been focusing on the genre, I feel like romance bookstores have been opening up all over the country all year. So it's been fun to be focusing on the genre as the genre seems to also be having a moment and the world is accepting it. And these bookstores are really popular and I love seeing that. We have our first romance bookstore in Connecticut, Montgomery and Taggart. We went there on their opening weekend and it was packed and they were selling out of books. I think it was shocking them. Just so happy for them. But I too was surprised at how many I did read because I also felt like I wasn't reading as many as I wanted. I think as I was filling out my card, what disappointed me was I didn't watch romances. And I had hoped to do some book to film adaptation watching or even just watch more romance and see how it made me feel to watch movies because I don't typically do that. And it's really funny because for one of my clients at the end of the year party, we found out that the CEO, who's this tough Marine, loves Hallmark Christmas movies and romance movies. And he had us play this whole game about them. And it was so fun and made me realize there are a ton of movies out there with romance at the core.
Oh, yeah. We've been watching a lot of Christmas romance rom-coms this season, and it's been a lot of fun.
Well, I'll have to get some recommendations from you. So that was one disappointment because the only thing that I watched was the Between the Covers, which I put on my documentary square, which is a documentary that I really enjoyed and kicked off the year watching. I didn't even watch it, Pride and Prejudice, which I thought for sure I would.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. So I totally forgot about that documentary too. It's just not on my bingo card. So maybe I need to spend a little bit more quality time with my bingo card before I submit it.
Yeah, well, we can do a video about it before the year's out if we have time. But we did want to remind everybody to send us your bingo card. This episode drops on the 31st of December. We originally said the bingo card was due the 31st of December. Maybe we should give you a few days into January so you get a chance to listen to this episode and be reminded. And we'll try to do some social media reminding as well. Send us a photo. We've already received one. When you send it to us, you'll be automatically entered to win a gift card for bookshop.org and buy yourself more romance or whatever you want.
Whatever you want. Maybe you're going to switch into a completely different genre.
Yeah. Like maybe ghost stories, which is what we're focusing on reading next year. Please join us for that.
Another thing we wanted to talk about, since this is our last episode of the year, is our reading intentions. At the beginning of the year, we talked about what our reading intentions were for this year. We like the word intentions more than goals because goals seems a little bit too focused, I think, and it's nice to have intentions because they guide you, but they could be a little bit loosey-goosey.
Flexible.
Yeah.
See where your reading life takes you instead of feeling like you're checking off a list of goals.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So would you like to go first, Emily? How did you do with your intentions?
I did well with some and not well with others. One of my intentions was to read all of Maggie O'Farrell, and she has 12 books I have read 9. I have 3 left. And interestingly, they're the first 3 that she ever wrote. And I think I started one and I was like, uh-oh, maybe I don't want to read her very first books. So I'm going to give myself a little break on that. I read 2 in this year, and it was Instructions for a Heat Wave and The Marriage Portrait. And I liked both of them very much. So maybe like if I'm at the library and I browse in the O'Farrell section and I see that one of those 3 is there, I might pick it up and see if it calls to me. But I'm not going to necessarily hyper-focus on her this year. And then what was a resounding success was my Monday short story reads. I really enjoyed that. It was really fun to know I'm waking up, it's Monday, what collection am I going to pull from? Or often I found myself bringing home things from Book Cougars headquarters that were new collections or something. It was really, really nice to focus on them. I read some great short stories. I did not read as many of the collections as I own, but that's okay. What I'm hoping for is that developing this habit over the year will help me pick them up more and feel good about reading one story. I think that's kind of what's prevented me in the past. You feel like you need to commit to it as a novel, and read it cover to cover. And this really helped me pick up a collection and just turn to a story in the middle, or often I would read the title story of the collection. It just seemed like a good place to start. Yeah. So I really enjoyed doing that.
That's great. You did such a fantastic job. I love when you're in a used bookstore and you see short story collections, and sometimes in the table of contents, you can see the former owner of the book has jotted the dates of when they read a short story, or they've just checked it off. Because you can, like you're saying, pick up that same collection every couple months or years and maybe eventually finish it, or maybe not. But it is nice to break that feeling of stress that you have to read the entire collection right away.
Yeah. And then the flip side of stress is sometimes you have authors whose novels are sitting on your book stacks, and I could read one of their short stories and feel like, oh, I got to read something they've written, but it was less of a commitment than reading an entire novel. And I really liked that. Or I loved the short story so much, it made me want to pick up one of the novels and read more of them.
Right.
Also, using it as kind of an introduction to them was really good. As far as my tracking of my reading on Goodreads, I did a very good job. It's something that I really enjoy doing. As of today, the day we're recording, which is December 26th, I have read 83 books. And my goal was to read 52, 1 book a week. So I'm having a good reading year. What I think didn't go as well for me was book to film adaptations. One of my goals this year, based on something that Russell had told us when we recorded with him at the beginning of last year, where he and his husband set goals for each other where they asked each other to do something. I had asked my partner, the gentleman caller, to watch one movie with me a month, something that was a book to film adaptation, and that did not go very well. So some of that was because I was away for quite a bit of the summer with my daughter who had a baby. And some of it was we really have a hard time finding things that we like in common. So better for us to not stress each other about that, I think.
Yeah.
We like to read together, so I have no complaints. But I think our TV watching time should be more separate. And then as far as cookbooks, I do think that I definitely read one new to me cookbook a month and cooked from it. What I didn't do well was track it. Like my short story project, I had a spreadsheet and I was very methodical about keeping track. I was not very good about keeping track of that. So that's, I don't have proof, I guess. For Biblio Adventures, we didn't get to any of the cookbook bookstores I was hoping that we might get to, but we had some great Biblio Adventures, like the Eric Carle Museum and our trip to Nyack. So it wasn't as if we didn't Biblio Adventure, but some of the intentions we set didn't happen.
Right.
I think we wanted to go to DC and, do some things like that, some more epic trips.
DC, and then going up to Maine to see Sarah Orange Jewett's house, which is now closed for the season. But I would really like to be able to do that next year. Laura and I went to D.C. to see one of our nieces who was living there temporarily, and that was cool. But you and I had fantasies of doing a whole bookish weekend down there.
Yeah, maybe this year.
Yeah.
So I think that's it for me. What about you?
Well, let's see. I'll get my handy list here. I think overall I did fairly well with my reading intentions. I do the same thing, the 52 books a year is my goal, is, a book a week. And I know I accomplished that. As of today, I've read 70 books.
Right on.
So that's pretty good. I finished the Willa Cather short story project in August. That was where I was reading one of her short stories a month. I started that in 2019. It was a really great experience to read through all those stories, and I'm still kind of thinking about all of them and wondering what my overall feeling about the experience is. One of my intentions was to read what I want when I want and not wait, because I had in the past fallen into that trap where it's like, oh, I'm going to save this book for Victober, or I'm going to save that book for Nonfiction November. And then that special reading month or week rolls around and it's like, oh, I'm not really in the mood for it. I think I did fairly well with that intention this year in reading what I wanted to when I wanted. I read 2 of the 3 19th century novels that I wanted to read. They have been on my TBR for a long time. I read A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. Super excited about both of those books. The one that I didn't get to, I put aside intentionally because Kate and I are going to be reading Silas Mariner by George Eliot next year as part of our quarterly classic buddy read that we have going on. I also put off my year of Margaret Fuller. So that one is one that didn't go quite so well, but I'm okay with it. Moby Dick kind of swept in and took all the air out of the room. And I'm happy with that as well. Moby Dick was a big surprise this year. And then romance, reading more romance than just the 4. I was a little worried about myself that I would just end up reading the 4 quarterly read-along picks. So I'm glad that I did read more romance than just the 4. Now for this coming year, I do want to be open to buddy reads, but not overdo it. I know that's a fine line. I have some coming up already I'm super excited about. Read more 19th century again. I just love that time period. And I am going to do Margaret Fuller in 2025. So that Library of America edition of the selected writings of Margaret Fuller is coming out. I believe my copy is on the way. I think the release date is in February, but they said if you pre-ordered it, they'd be shipping it out in December as soon as it arrived at their offices. And I did get a shipping notification, which I think is that book. So I would love for somebody to buddy read some of the works in that book with me, particularly Summer on the Lakes in 1842, which is a travelogue, kind of experimental piece of writing. There's some fiction in it, some travelogue of her traveling to Michigan in 1842. And then also Women in the 19th Century. Those are the 2 biggies that I definitely want to read in 2025. And then that collection also has some of her experimental fiction, some letters, some of her reviews, and then her journalistic dispatches. So I'm not going to stress out about that. I'm just going to enjoy Margaret Fuller. And then I think I, in some ways, would like to read fewer books and think about them more deeply and write about them, write about what I'm reading more, whether that be in my journal or on my blog or occasional reviews. I haven't done very many reviews in the last few years, but I did write one for Criminal Element on Marcia Clark's new book, Trial by Ambush. And it was kind of fun to write a review again like that for publication. So I don't know. It was a really good reading year. I'm always surprised when I look back at my reading lists that I read more than I think I do.
Yeah.
Which is silly to say, isn't it?
No, I think reflecting makes such a difference. I mean, I was so shocked when I looked back on the romance books that I read. I really was. So I think it is giving yourself time to reflect on them. One thing that I think as someone who sits across the table from you, that was fun to watch was when you said that you were going to read what you want when you wanted. I feel like that worked out really well for you this year. And it did seem like it caused you less stress. And you did still do a bunch of buddy reading and had things sketched out that you wanted to read, but you gave yourself grace if it didn't work out. And I think that's what setting that intention is a reminder as you face things that come your way in your decision making about your reading. So I think that's what we mean about intentions versus goals, that it is nice because it gives you a framework, but the framework is flexible.
Right. Yeah. Well, I do have 4 classics that I'll be reading with Kate, and they are all 19th century. We're going to be doing Old New York by Edith Wharton, Silas Mariner by George Eliot, The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, which will fit in nicely with our ghost theme, and then The Red and the Black by Stendhal, which is a book I've wanted to read forever because there used to be a used bookstore in Chicago by Loyola's Lakeshore campus called The Red and the Black that not too many people remember. But I've wanted to read that book since then, so since like the mid-90s. So I think 2025 will be the year for that.
Well, my reading intentions for 2025 are exploring becoming a completist with favorite authors. Being a completist is a term I didn't know until this year when my friend Chris Wolak said it to me. So now I'm slightly obsessed.
Did you have some in mind?
Yeah, some contenders. And these, I just scribbled them down very quickly. And I think it's about not so much being able to say that I'm a completist, but about realizing like, oh, have I read everything that these people whose writing I adore have written? Mm-hmm. It's a good chance to go back and look. One of them is Anna Quindlen. I love her writing so much. Alice Hoffman. I think I've read everything by her, but maybe I haven't. Erica Wood, who was an author I discovered this year, who I'd never heard of, and adore her writing. And I read 2 of her novels this year and dipped into one of her short story collections, but didn't read the whole thing. And then Catherine Newman, whose name you might hear again on my top 10 list. Janine Cummins, who's somebody who I like her writing a lot. And Aunt Ellen recommended one of her books as one of her favorites for the year that I'd never heard of. So I think it's about that, taking some time to explore some of my favorite authors or authors whose works I've really enjoyed and look at their backlist, and see if I've read it. And then it'd be fun to say I'm a completist, but I don't want to say it in like a snobby, snarky sort of way.
No, I think being a completist, well, certainly some people could be snobby if they wanted to be about it, but I think it is the joy of reading everything that a favorite writer has written, and then being able to look at their life and reading journey over time. I think it's really special to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think about that added part of it. And then I, too, am going to set my Goodreads goal at 52 books. I'm considering possibly swapping out my short story project for an essay project, but I'm not sure if I want to commit. I mean, I had to laugh when I was reflecting on my intentions. I don't know if you remember that I had originally considered reading a short story a day.
Yeah.
And then I was like, maybe I should shoot for 1 day a week, which I'm very glad I had the sense to do.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I want to commit, but then there's a part of me that knows that it was successful because I had set aside a day to be looking at that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to think on that.
All right. I think reading a short story a day is obviously doable, but I think that is so many stories in your head then.
Yeah.
That I think it would be hard to read novels as well. I mean, at least for me, because I could only have so many stories bouncing around in my head at a time. And you know how profound short stories can be. Sometimes you read that last paragraph and you're like, wow, you're just kind of shot for the day.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, they pack a punch. So I'll report back on that.
Okay.
And then on Ingredient One, which is a Substack that I occasionally write from, I would like to concentrate on cookbooks and food memoirs more there. There are some really good food memoirs coming out in 2025. So I will keep y'all posted on that. I'm hoping I might come up with a little bit of a schedule to hold myself a little bit more accountable there. And then Biblio Adventures, I was thinking it'd be really fun to somehow bring in my love of museums Or like, you know how we look at the Morgan Library and say, what is the exhibit that's coming? Would there be something to read? Right now they have that great exhibit about their librarian, and you've already read the novelization of her life.
Yeah, Belle de Costa Green.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they have Franz Kafka. Mm-hmm. He has some fantastic short stories and short novels, really fun, readable, weird stuff in some ways out there.
Yeah, and I think back to when we went to Edith Wharton's House the Mount, and we read some of her ghost short stories, you know, like the day before we went. And then the drive up there, we talked about the short stories. So I'd love to have some intentions around that combine our reading life with our biblio adventures. Right now, there's a great exhibit of some Georgia O'Keeffe works at a museum here in Connecticut. And I thought, ooh, it'd be really fun to read the biography of her life. I have read the book that was called Georgia. I'm blanking on the author right now. I'll put that in the show notes, which was a fictionalized account of Georgia O'Keeffe's life that I loved. So I'm thinking about that. The idea is an intention right now, but nothing in place there. But maybe we can work on that a little. And then the last thing is just an idea I'm putting out there to see if anyone's interested of maybe doing some sort of book to film adaptation watch-along club where we wouldn't necessarily watch together, but we would watch separately and then have a little discussion about it. If anyone's interested in that, let me know, because I might be interested in that.
Very cool.
Since it failed with my gentleman golfer.
Yeah.
Yeah, so some fun things ahead. I'm looking forward to our reading life together in 2025 and separately.
Yeah, same here. And I want to mention two other reading intentions. Two of our listeners are doing buddy reads, read-alongs. Colleen is going to be doing Willa Cather novel reading challenge, where she and a group of people read one Cather novel a month and have a check-in on Instagram one weekend, and then the next weekend have a Zoom conversation. People could participate in one or the other. You don't have to do the whole shebang. You don't have to do all 12 novels. You can dip in here and there. And we'll put a link to Colleen's Instagram in the show notes, just if you want to connect with her. It's never too late.
Yeah, she already posted a really great schedule. It's very organized, so you could think about, there might even be a book you want to read 3/4 into the year or something. But
right, yeah. First up is Alexander's Bridge for January. And then Robin G. from Sacramento, she is doing a buddy read of Swan's Way by Proust, which is his first novel in his series of novels based on his life and memory. So I'm really looking forward to that, because he's one of those authors I haven't read and people either love or they avoid or they mock because he's talking about his life in so many novels. So that is going to be in February and March. And I love doing buddy reads like this, especially when other people figure out the schedule. Right. Yeah, so 2025, I'm excited about another year of reading with you and reading with our community.
Yeah, and speaking of our community, the next Patreon reading salon, we're going to be talking about reading intentions. That takes place the fourth Sunday of every month at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The next one will be January 26th. So if you are a member of our Patreon community at the $5 or above level, you will get an invite to that. And we would love to hear what other people's reading intentions are for the year.
Yeah. Now, so the reading salon is an example of something new that we tried in 2024. Like, we had no idea if people would be interested, but we just wanted to get together and talk with people about books because we always have such a good time with the read-along discussions. And so that reading salon has turned out just to be one of the highlights of my month and something I really look forward to.
Yeah, and really has helped me discover new authors. People are so well read. It's really fun. Yeah.
Yes.
So, Chris, what are you currently reading?
I am reading Lucy Undying, a Dracula novel by Kirsten White. This just came out this fall, and I am loving it. It's so much fun so far. I'm just a little about 20% in, and it is taking the characters from Bram Stoker's Dracula. Primarily Lucy is one of the big characters, Lucy Undying. I think you can figure out she's like the lead character, right? She's one of my least favorite characters in Dracula. I've always thought of her as just boring. She's blonde and all the men like her, and she's weak and she dies, you know? Not my favorite, especially compared to Mina, who is like a real action hero in a lot of ways in Dracula. I am really digging this Lucy, this version of her in the book. I was wondering how the author was going to handle the thing about her being killed as a vampire, because, spoiler alert, she does become a vampire in Dracula, but she is then killed, beheaded, and a stake is driven through her heart. It's one of those scenes that people comment on a lot because it's filled with a lot of sexual tension and violence. And so how Kirsten White gets around Lucy in that situation, I thought was fantastic. There are a lot of strong women characters in this novel, including a vampire woman who's like the queen of China and is not letting any of Dracula's spawn in. So more to come on that. It's Lucy in the past and present, because she's a vampire, so she's been alive now for 200 years, I guess. And then another character who is a contemporary, who is an ancestor of one of the other characters in the novel, whose mom had this organization that sounds a little bit like a pyramid scheme that is kind of in part religious. So it makes me think of that one religion that a lot of actors are involved in.
Church of Scientology, you mean?
Yeah, you don't really know what's going on exactly. It's like a lot of wealth and blood is involved. So more to come on this. But the story is told from Lucy's perspective, this other woman character's perspective, Iris is her name, and then a psychologist or a therapist's patient notes, as I think it's Lucy who's talking to a therapist. So it's a lot of good fun. I mean, it's a bit gory too, not terribly so at this point, 20% in, but it's a lot of fun if you're a fan of the novel Dracula, because there's a lot of things that she drops. Yeah. So that is Lucy Undying by Kirsten White. Oh, I'm reading it as an e-copy. It's not surprising that for Iris's character to have a lot of ghosts in the closet, I suppose, based on her family's history that we're just learning about here and there. And then Lucy with her life history or death history, her vampiric history. This is a quote from one of the characters. "I walk with the ghosts of everyone I've ever been, and I don't know which I am, or if I'm one of the dead that haunts me. Stories are hauntings, aren't they? The ghosts we carry with us everywhere. I'll try to tell you my stories in order. Build a house for you where all my ghosts can be contained and haunt you in a way you can make sense of." I just thought that was some nice ghost action there to share.
Yeah, see, look at you getting started with your ghost stories already.
Getting my ghost on.
Get your ghost on, girl. Well, I'm reading two books that are not out yet. One of them is called Speak to Me of Home by Janine Cummins. This book comes out on May 13th, so it's a ways off. You can obviously pre-order it now. Janine Cummins, if her name sounds familiar, she got into a little bit of trouble with her last novel, which was called American Dirt. It was very controversial. You can look it up online if you want to learn more about it. Essentially, part of what she got in trouble for was writing about something that people thought she didn't know enough about and was not skilled enough in her reporting nor of the right heritage to be writing about, which was people who were escaping to America on a train from Ecuador, running from drug lords and trying to become American citizens. She did do some research. All of it was called to task. Some authors signed things saying that they wanted to blackball her from society. She got canceled pretty quickly. The book got canceled.
And part of it was due to the publisher's insensitive marketing as well, with some of the imagery, like using barbed wire as part of a beautiful image.
Well, it was like part of the publishing event, and then Janine Cummins did her nails in barbed wire. There was definitely some insensitivity. There was problems in all directions. Was the book compelling? If you ask me, I'm raising my hand. Yes, I thought it was a great read, but I understood some of what the objections were, of course. I also objected to many of the authors who stood up and had things to say who never read the novel, which I think is problematic. Anywho, as Chris Wallach would say, here she is with a new novel, and this one is closer to home. I believe one of her parents is from the United States, and one of her parents hails from Puerto Rico. Janine Cummins herself is married to an Irishman, so she has written about that in prior works of, I think, nonfiction and fiction. This book, one of the things I'm enjoying about it so far is it jumps around in time. It makes me think about folks were talking about on our reading salon conversation about God of the Woods, and that being a favorite read of the year. And I think one of the things that was mentioned was that the author plays around a lot with timeline. And so I thought about that as I started to read this, because the opening chapter is 2023, and then it skips to 1958, and then 2009. So it's going back and forth, and it's about a young woman who comes to the United States with her family from Puerto Rico. Then it's also about the descendants of that young woman, who's now not a young woman, obviously. One of the things I adore about this book already, even though I'm barely into it, is that, and I'm going to show this to Chris, there's a great character map and timeline on the front, which I'm constantly flipping back and forth to. Very helpful. I'll be curious how they handle that in the finished copy, because I'm reading a paper arc of it. I love the characters. I think she's a great writer so far. I don't have much to say about the story because I'm just barely into it. Again, that's called Speak to Me of Home by Janine Cummins, out May 13th. And then I'm also reading one that's nonfiction called Permission, The New Memoirist and the Courage to Create by Alyssa Altman. And this book comes out on March 11th. Alyssa Altman wrote a memoir that I loved called Motherland, about her narcissistic mother growing up with her and what her life was like, and her love for her father who passed away. She's written some other memoirs, and she teaches memoir all over the country. What this book so far is about is when one of the memoirs she wrote, she revealed what she didn't realize for a lot of her family was a family secret. In her family of origin, it was talked about every day, so it wasn't a secret to her. And that was that her father's mother, so Alyssa's grandmother, abandoned her children for a period of time in their youth. And it was very formative for her father and her aunt. Her father talked about it with her all the time. And then when she wrote about it in a memoir, she was at a family wedding, and one of her cousins came up and basically said, "We are deleting you from our family. You are canceled from our family." And it was life-changing for her and totally unexpected, because she didn't realize this was a secret. So what she's writing about in this is about how to be a memoirist, how you're always going to write about things that are challenging to your family members. I think it's probably going to be a master class in it, because she teaches memoir. So again, that's called Permission, The New Memoirist and the Courage to Create.
People.
I know,
people
life
and
is
families.
complicated.
Gosh. Yes.
Indeed.
Well, what have you just read?
Well, I read 2 short stories from my short story advent calendar that I talked about on our holiday episode. And we did do a video last week on YouTube where I showed the advent calendar. So I'll put a link in the show notes so you can see that. It's this group of little thin booklets. I read the first 2, and number 1 was called In the Stacks by Robin Sloan. This opens up with a librarian in the makerspace of the library who's picking melted plastic out of the 3D printer, which I just laughed when I read that. And in the library, there's a music studio with a big red synthesizer. Every Wednesday, an 83-year-old patron comes to work on the synthesizer, and she's the only one seemingly who knows how to plug it in and do anything with it. So for the first half an hour that she's there, because she reserves the space for 2 hours, the first half an hour she spends plugging everything in. She synthesizes for an hour, and then she spends the next half an hour unplugging everything, because the rule is you have to leave it unplugged. And there's a teenage character who comes in and tries to figure it out and can't. The 83-year-old patron is the only one seemingly who knows how to use it. And one day when the librarian comes into the room, there's a little note that says, "Do not disturb until played for King Ozzy." And the synthesizer has been left plugged in, and the story goes on from there.
Interesting.
It is very compelling. I thought about all you librarians as I was reading it and what a great thing the library is and these maker spaces and music libraries. And a lot of them have podcast studios and all this stuff now. But I loved the conceit that this 83-year-old patron was the only one who knew how to use it and all its wires. And then the second one that I read was called The Hookup by Catherine Haney. And this is about Bodhi, who's a high school senior living on the Upper West Side with his Hungarian grandmother and his father. His mother has passed away. He's dating a young woman named Rebecca, who's soon to be the valedictorian of their Excelsior High School graduating class. And his grandmother spends a lot of time polishing antiques in the apartment and kind of like tisking about life and things. And Bodhi's father is visited one day by the FBI. They want to talk to him about a recent purchase that he made. Then the other character that's involved is Bodhi's high school teacher, Kibbles. He comes to visit his father, which makes him very uncomfortable. They go into his father's study and close the door. The story is about history and possessions and what the possessions mean to people and how they might eventually possess you. I have had a Catherine Haney novel on my shelf for so many years that I want to read, so it was really fun to read a short story by her. And as I was reading these little booklets, I was like, what am I going to do with these when I'm done? And I've decided that as I read them, I'm going to think about a person that I might want to send them on to and spend however long it takes me to read these 25 stories, spend the time sending them off. That'll be one of my reading intentions for this year also, to write a little card and send the story off to somebody. Super fun.
That sounds great. Well, I finished Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. This was a reread for me. I mainly listened to the audio version, which is narrated by Juanita McMahon. She does a great job. I mean, it's 19 hours, 40 minutes. It's a bit of a chunkster of a book. The voices got to me, though, after a while. This is a novel set in 19th century London. And so the different accents, I thought she did a great job with. I speak American English. I couldn't tell you necessarily where the different accents come from, but you can tell they're of different classes and backgrounds and everything. Some of them were harder to listen to than others after a while. I love this novel so much, though. When it first came out, Laura and I both read it. I really enjoy Sarah Waters' earlier novels. I don't really care much for her more recent novels. But Fingersmith is about a young girl who's raised as an orphan in basically a household of criminals. So it's very Dickensian in that regard. Sarah Waters, to back up a little bit, has a PhD in Victorian literature. And I think her PhD, her dissertation focused on queer writers and lit from that time period. I'm not 100% on that. But she really loves 19th century fiction and Dickens in particular, and it really shows in the way this story is presented. Fantastic. There's a character called Gentleman. He's maybe in his later 20s who has this scheme in mind for the young woman to be sent to work as a maid for this lady who Gentleman wants to basically make fall in love with him and take her money. He's tried this scheme before, but he's always foiled. Just when he thinks he's going to get the girl and marry her for her wealth, it falls apart. The story is told in 3 parts, basically, from the 2 women's perspectives. It is twisty and turny, and there's not a lot I want to say about it because I don't want to give any spoilers. It's half of the fun of this book is the unveiling of what's going on and who's doing what. There's also some really hard scenes to read. A character ends up in a madhouse for women, and her treatment is pretty horrific. And you just think of how many women were wrongfully admitted into these houses where I think some medical people thought they were doing the right thing, and other places it was just holding pens and a ripe environment for abuse. I wanted to read a bit of a section. The wealthy woman lives with her uncle on an estate, and he is a scholarly man working on a huge project that's taking decades. He has some other men over, and they're having dinner and they're talking. They start talking about the new technology of photography and how different that is and how it will change the way people consume literature. The guy's going on and on about how great photography is. And then the uncle says, "Doth not a book endure?" And one of the guests says that photographs will endure so long as words do. But in a photograph, you have a thing beyond words and beyond the mouths that speak them. A photograph will provoke heat in an Englishman, a Frenchman, a savage. It will outlast us all and provoke heat in our grandsons. It is a thing apart from history. And then the uncle says, "It is gripped by history. It is corrupted by it. Its history hangs about it like so much smoke. You may see it in the fitting of a slipper, a gown, the dressing of a head. Give photographs to your grandson. He will study them and think them quaint. He will laugh at the wax tips of your mustaches. But words, Hawtrey, words, they seduce us in darkness, and the mind clothes and fleshes them to fashions of its own." I just love that, because I think that's so true with photographs from the past. And I also don't want to talk too much about what kind of photographs or, artwork or anything. But yeah, what we think now is great photography, give it a generation or two and it will look quaint as well.
Yes, for sure.
So I really love that. And just the power of books to really stir the imagination. And you lay your own things on it. So even if you're reading like the Epic of Gilgamesh, right, you are visualizing it in your own way to make it come alive.
Yeah.
I love that so much. Fingersmith with a buddy read with somebody who shall be unnamed for now. And I highly recommend it. Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. And also check out Tipping the Velvet by her. That is my favorite Sarah Waters and one of my top 10 novels of all time.
Well, I'm glad it held up. There's always that risk when you listen to something or read something again that you loved. Folks, I try to have a book that I read as a crossover book, which means the book that I am reading from December 31st to January 1st. And I decided what that book was going to be, and I went to the library to get it, and then I have zero self-control because I read it, and it's December 26th. So
I can't say I'm surprised, Emily.
So I have to pick a new book. But this is called We All Want Impossible Things by Catherine Newman. She is also the author of Sandwich, which will be on my top 10 list for this year. And this book is autofiction. It's semi-autobiographical, but it is a novel. And it is about a woman whose friend of many years since her childhood is dying of cancer in her 40s and has been sent to hospice. Her best friend, who is the narrator of the novel, and the woman's husband decide that it's best for her to go to hospice up in the area where this woman lives and not back at home because there's a young son involved and they don't want his life to be too interrupted. So her husband and the young son stay back at home, and her best friend is the one who's caretaking her along with the hospice workers. And this hospice is more of a house situation. It doesn't feel like a hospital. So she gets to know the people who are working there. It's very familial. There's people who come in and play guitar and people who bring their dogs in and play music and things like that. It could be a horribly sad book. It's not, because Catherine Newman is a fantastic writer. She's very funny and irreverent. And if anybody has been through something like this, which I've done several times now with people I love, there's always humor in the darkest moments in life. And I feel like she captures that so well in this novel. the woman who, even like I said, even though it's fictional, this is Catherine Newman's childhood friend that she's writing about. They grew up together. They're very close. It's poignant in a way that can be deeply felt if you still have a childhood friend in your life, or if you just can remember those childhood friendships where you shared so much. And so it almost seems like it makes sense that you would share to the end of their life with them, even when the ending is very painful and coming at a time that you're not expecting. Catherine Newman also writes about the messiness of life, which I really appreciate. You know, life is messy. It's very, very messy. I think, like Sandwich, there might be a few things that don't appeal to people about this novel, including the fact that one of the ways that she's dealing with her grief is to sleep with a lot of different people, and that might be uncomfortable for some. And then she talks to her children in a very familiar way, very unboundaried, like about the people she's sleeping with, and that might be uncomfortable to people as well. I didn't have any problem with it. I find it funny and very real, and she doesn't have a lot of boundaries. And I think sometimes that's how you establish really good friendships with people, and why she can be taking care of her friend as she's dying in hospice. Again, it's called We All Want Impossible Things by Catherine Newman. It would have been a great crossover book for 24 to 25, but I will be finding something else and reporting back.
Nice. Well, I finished The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, and I love this novel so much. I am so glad I finally got to it, and I'm a little annoyed that I didn't get to it sooner, or that it isn't one that is taught very regularly. It's a tough novel in terms of its subject matter. It was published in 1848, and it is the story of a woman named Helen, who, as a young person, a teenager who, knows everything, makes a bad marriage to a man who is an alcoholic and a libertine and has friends who are just as bad as he is, but he's also one of the instigators to all of their bad behavior. So it's painful in that regard, but it is so fresh at the same time, fresh as in seeming new. It's written in epistolary form and then diary. So it starts with a man named Markham, who is a farmer. He's kind of an educated farmer who is a little bit humorous because he lives with his mom and his sister and brother. Helen, this woman, Mrs. Graham, as she's known, moves into Wildfell Hall, into some rooms at this big hall that is dilapidated and kind of falling down. She moves in. She's there with her young son, and everybody's abuzz about who she is, and there's all these rumors flying around. And Markham, at the beginning, is attracted to this other woman in town, but his affections soon travel to Mrs. Graham. So she doesn't really want to have much to do with him or anybody. I think I mentioned in the prior episode, Mrs. Graham is a painter trying to support herself and her son. She can't let people know where she is. So even though she's painting lovely landscapes with Wildfell Hall in it, she titles the painting something else so that there's no clue that her style could trace the painting back to where she actually is. Long story short, she rips out pages of her journals to give to Markham to say, this is my story, leave me alone. Maybe you'll understand. So then her story, his letters are a little bit formal, and in the beginning he's a bit cocky and annoying in his righteousness. And then her diary is just, wow. I couldn't put the book down when I was reading the parts of her diary, even though you know what's coming when there's some naive young teenager talking about, oh, I can change him. You know, it's not going to end all that well. And then towards the end, it goes back to letters again between Markham and a friend of his talking about the whole life situation. Really fantastic. It is a bit of a longer novel. I think it was over 500 pages. I have to thank Tina, one of our listeners, who wrote in when she heard me talking about this to say, sorry if you already know this, but if you don't know this, the 1848 edition that was the first public edition is usually not the one that's often printed these days. There is an 1854 edition that is missing parts of the book because Anne's sister Charlotte didn't really condone the subject matter of this book. She thought it was too base, too negative. So it cuts off the first chapter, which is basically Markham's letter to his friend that sets up the structure of the whole novel. So to take that away is really strange because then you don't know who this person is who Markham refers to. You don't get that really. And then there's another significant chapter that's missing a chunk. So I'm really happy that I ditched that first edition that I had of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall because it was based on that 1854 edition, although it doesn't say that anywhere.
So did you go back and read the first chapter then?
Well, luckily I started with this.
Oh, you did start with I thought you had started the other one.
Well, you know what? I didn't really. I mean, it just wasn't feeling right in my hand. So I got this Penguin Classics, and it is the 1848 edition as Anne Bronte, the author, intended it. And one of the things that alerted Tina to reach out to me was that I mentioned I was reading the E version from Project Gutenberg and the paper book. I was kind of bouncing back and forth. And she told me that the Project Gutenberg E version is missing sections 1854 edition. So thank you so much, Tina, for saving me on that. I really appreciate it. Tina is a PhD student and her dissertation is on Anne Bronte. And there's a really nice video that she sent along that we'll put in the show notes of her doing a presentation at the Bodleian Library in England, looking at some of the first editions and different editions of Anne and some of the other sisters' work.
So cool.
I love this book so much. There is the 19th century piety that is a turnoff for some contemporary readers, possibly. It didn't bother me that much because I guess I'm used to it with 19th century.
Maybe you balanced it by reading Fingersmith.
Interesting. Possibly. I just really loved Helen. Her piety didn't bother me. Maybe if I read this when I was 18, when I was her age, when she started her adventure in this novel, I might have been like, oh my God, I'm going to go party with her husband or something. But reading it as a 58-year-old person who's seen more life, I really appreciated this novel. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, Anne Bronte.
I finished a book called Little Great Island by Kate Woodworth. This book is publishing on May 6th, and this is from Sibylline Press, which is a press that only publishes women over the age of 50. Definitely a press worth checking out. I will put a link in the show notes so you can see their catalog. This tells the story of Mari, who returns to her hometown, Little Great Island, which is off the coast of Maine, with her young son Levi, and she's fleeing a cult called God's Bounty. Her hair has been shaved. Her son has a sore on his tongue. She doesn't know where it came from, but she knew it was time for her to get out of there quickly, so she fled. She gets home, her parents accept her and welcome her and their grandson back in, who they've never met. She was completely out of touch when she was in this cult. Once she arrives, the only thing she really knows how to do anymore is farm, because it's one of the things they did at God's Bounty was farm. And she becomes very involved in the weather and how it's affecting the livelihood of people who live on Maine, including her father, who's a lobsterman. And the lobsters have been moving farther and farther off the coast. In real life, climate change is very much affecting the coast of Maine. The sea level is rising, but it's also warming up a lot, which is affecting a lot of things there. Another character comes into the story. He is someone who's recently widowed. He is someone who summers on the island and grew up coming and knows this woman, Mari, and her family. And he's considering selling the property and decides that maybe they'll sell it to a developer. So there lies the rub. There are people who care about the long-term sustainability of the island who are year-rounders. There are summer people. There are people who make their living there and people who are only coming to enjoy the summer bounty. I really enjoyed the way that she talked about climate change. This is a novel of climate fiction, but it wasn't heavy-handed in any way. It was really looking at it from all different angles and seeing how important it was from the people who lived there to have some version of industry. And is it industry that brings tourists? Is it industry that sustains them year-round? There's so many islands off the coast of Maine. You can only imagine how real this is. I thought her writing was great. I've never read anything by Kate Woodworth. This is, I believe, her second book. I highly recommend it. Put it on your pre-order list now. Kate Woodruff's Little Great Island. The other book I read, I'll just talk about quickly. This was recommended at one of our reading salons when I said that I wanted to read a hockey romance and had started one and didn't like it. I didn't like some of the languaging in it. It wasn't appropriate for my feminist ideals. And so she said, well, try this one. It's a young adult graphic novel. It's called Check, Please, Book 1, #hockey. And it's about a young man who's a freshman in college. He's a vlogger. He's also someone who loves to bake pies. And it's him learning to make it as a freshman hockey player and also as a gay young boy who's trying to figure out his way. You know, graphic novels just don't work for me, Chris. We've talked about this before. All I want to do is read. I don't really want to look at the pictures. Sometimes I don't understand the way to read it because there's bubbles that are all over the frame and I get confused and I find it very frustrating. I thought the story was really sweet. The author was in school at Yale when she started to follow hockey and became very enamored of it, and she wanted to make some art and decided to write a graphic novel, but felt like if I'm going to write a graphic novel about hockey, I need to really understand what it is. So there's a lot of hockey. If you're a hockey fan, you'll like this book. I didn't not like it, but I didn't really enjoy the process of reading it. I really enjoy reading books with just words.
Yeah, you and the uncle from Fingersmith, apparently.
And I like picture books a lot, which have big pictures and little words. But a book where you really have to follow the story with so much. I mean, this is a big, long book. It was a couple hundred pages. It was a lot of work.
Yeah, it takes a lot of brain power.
Yes.
I'm just like you with that. It's not an easy reading experience at all for me to read a graphic novel.
Yeah. So I'm still looking for a more classic sports romance. If anyone has recommendations, let me know. Chris, did you have any Biblio adventures?
I did. Well, we both had one together, our reading salon, which was a lot of fun to hear about some of their favorite reads of the year. People came with their top 1 to 3 favorites, which was fun.
Reminder that we have a Google document where you can enter your top 10 reads of the year. That link will be in the show notes.
Yes. And please, fill that out because it is so much fun to see what everybody has enjoyed for the year. The other thing I did, I watched an adaptation of Robert Harris's book, Conclave. It came out in 2016. The only reason I heard about this movie is because I follow Isabella Rossellini on Instagram, and she's in it. She's like, I basically stand around and look really stern. But it's a really great cast in this movie. And it is about a pope dies, and the main character is set to be the one who manages the process of all the cardinals coming and voting for a new pope. He's kind of the main character in the movie. There are some other characters who are significant to the story as it was adapted anyway. And it's all men, it's all cardinals who are either power hungry or they don't think they are, or they want to push for their cause and change the church. Other people want the church to go backwards. I can imagine the book must be a very deep look at men's spirituality and their quest for power, or how they understand themselves, because throughout the movie, the characters do come to understand themselves in different ways. And Isabella Rossellini plays a nun. She's in charge of all the women at the Vatican when this is going on. There's one bishop who shows up that they did not know about. He's a bishop that has been in war zones, and the Pope had, I don't know what you call it when you make someone a bishop, but the Pope had made this person a bishop in secret, which is totally doable. And I think it had a lot to do with the war zones that the person was in, because in Muslim countries, having a Catholic cardinal wouldn't be the best thing. There's a big shift in the movie. I hate to say there's a big twist, because I know that is a bit of a spoiler, but the movie ends in ways I did not anticipate. What I thought was going to happen didn't happen, and I'm glad it went in a very different direction. So it's a slow movie. It's beautifully filmed. The cinematography was wonderful. A lot of iconic imagery. I don't know if that would be one you'd be interested in, Emily, as an adaptation, but that was Conclave is the name of it.
Yeah, I've seen it advertised. Cool. Well, I watched something much different than Conclave. I am binging season 6 of Virgin River, which is based on the books by Robin Carr, which I've never read. I believe there's 21 books in the series. Do you ever read, I think in Book Page, they have the interviews with authors where they ask them about their guilty pleasure reading, or it's in the New York Times by the book. I can't remember. It's a probably frequently asked question. And so many authors are like, oh, there's no such thing as a guilty pleasure read. I feel so guilty when I watch this. And then recently on Facebook, our Booktopia friend Karen posted that she was watching it and she loved it. And then other people were piping in and I was like, oh, hallelujah. I'm not alone. I also see people this time of year posting bad Christmas movies that they love. To me, it's like that. It's so bad. It's so good, you know?
Uh-huh.
And it makes me think of soap operas. I don't know if soap operas are popular anymore, but it's like that kind of a thing where bad things keep happening and happening. You're like, oh my, how many bad things can happen in this small town? Talk about beautifully filmed. It's beautifully filmed. Everybody in it is beautiful. I just adore it so much. It just relaxes me to watch it. I think that's what I like about it. And it's based on this idea of this woman who's a midwife who comes to this small town to kind of leave some tragedy in her own life behind, and then starts working for the local town doctor, and all the cast of characters, including Jack, who's an ex-Marine and is incredibly handsome and debonair and owns the local watering hole. And it makes me think about someone, is it Colleen maybe, who complains sometimes when she's reading that the people that have jobs never do any work. Is it Colleen? I think it's Colleen.
I don't remember who that was, but yeah, it's ringing a bell.
Sorry, Colleen, if I'm talking terms out of school. But that's kind of how I feel about, you know, being someone who's worked in the restaurant business. There's like a huge restaurant that's at the heart of this town, and the owner's never working there, right. Which I think is hilarious. And then I also am trying to still get through All Fours by Miranda July. I've gotten the audiobook. So I did listen to an interview with her with Terry Gross on Fresh Air. I should say I'm halfway through. I just don't care.
Yeah.
I decided I don't care. But
yeah.
We'll see.
Sometimes it's, I don't know, every now and then a book could take off, you know, but it's like, how much time do you give it to hope that might happen? Or
yeah, I don't think this one is about taking off. I think it's about the subject matter, the way she's living her life. I just don't care, which sounds so mean and harsh. I don't know. This one is it's on so many top tens, but then so many people I know have given it 1 star, and then others gave it 5. It's just so interesting, as always. It's one of those kind of books.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Like the book I'm reading, Lucy Undying, I try not to see reviews before I read a book, but I couldn't help just glance a little bit, and some people are like, oh my God, how could you make a lesbian vampire book boring? Giving it 1 stars. But yeah, it's just, you know, different tastes, different times. We've talked about that a lot, right?
Totally. So what about upcoming jaunts?
I don't have anything completely on my books. I have a lot of things in mind. I'm recovering still from being sick, so that kind of put a damper on plan making. I am going to be going to Chicago for a week to see my mom. So there is that coming up in January.
Nice.
Yeah. How about you?
Well, we do have, maybe in your COVID haze, you forgot that I did convince you to get tickets for something in April, which is far away.
Yes.
But I do want to tell people, because there's a virtual option for this, but tickets might, I don't know how it works with virtual. They probably sell them infinitely. But on April 30th at 7 p.m., Symphony Space in New York City, we have in-person tickets for one of their selected shorts events, Classics with a Twist. And Meg Wolitzer, Sarah Bareilles, and Sarah Rule will be delivering the Classics with a Twist. I'm so excited.
Me too.
But we will put a link in the show notes if you want to meet us there. We'd love to see you. There also is, like I said, a virtual option if you want to purchase tickets that way.
Nice. What about upcoming reads?
Well, I'm still trying to figure out my crossover book for 2024 to 2025. I'm considering, because usually I do read nonfiction for that, and that's why I convinced myself it was okay to dig into that novel. So I'm considering revisiting, because I never finished it, The Creative Act, A Way of Being by Rick Rubin. I had started listening to the audiobook and I really loved it and then didn't finish, but it seems like that could be a fun one to usher in the new year with. Mm-hmm. The other one I have is the new Jonathan Evison book. I love his novels. And this one is called The Heart of Winter. And I believe it's out January 7th. What about you?
Well, I'll be reading Alexander's Bridge by Willa Cather. That'll be coming up soon. And then I also do have a buddy read of A New Home Who'll Follow by Caroline Kirkland. With Sigrid, we're going to buddy read this one together. And this is a nonfiction account of Kirkland's experience on the Michigan frontier in the 1830s. Now, as far as what my crossover book is going to be from 24 to 25, I'm not sure. I think I'll be finished with Lucy Undying by then. And if I'm not, that will be my crossover. And if I am finished, I don't know. We'll see. I'm going to do it by mood, I think, whatever I'm in the mood for.
Good idea.
Well, coming up next, everyone, is our conversation with Pamela D Toler, author of The Dragon from Chicago, The Untold Story of an American Reporter in Nazi Germany.
And this is about the journalist Sigrid Schultz. Her career spanned from 1920 all the way up to when she died in 1980. She was still even doing some writing then. Really compelling story. Loved having this conversation with Pamela. We loved it so much that at the end, you're going to hear that we kind of sign off with her. And then we had more questions and the conversation continued. Yes. So keep listening. It's worth it.
Yeah, totally it is. And this is such a compelling read, as Emily said. Like, she was there, Sigrid was there in Germany from World War I, prior to World War I, all the way through World War II. For the most part, she was gone back in the States for a couple years, but she knew so many languages and she knew the German culture so well. So for her to be the Chicago Tribune's reporter on the ground there was, I think, I mean, talk about being like the right person at the right place at the right time. And then having the wherewithal to become a reporter and a journalist like she did. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and Pamela's writing is so accessible. She really tells a great story. I enjoyed it so much. I read both the print copy and listened to the audiobook, which was well done as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is just such a compelling read.
Yeah.
And we loved talking with Pamela, so we hope you enjoy our conversation. Happy reading!
We are thrilled to talk today with Dr. Pamela D Toler. Dr. Toler is the author of 10 works of nonfiction for both children and adults. Her subjects have included an Everything Guide to Understanding Socialism, Women Warriors Throughout History, a woman driver who led French forces across minefields and through enemy lines in Africa during World War II, and 2 companion books for popular TV series, one on Civil War nurses for PBS, and the other a sweeping history of humanity for the History Channel. We appreciate the tagline on her website, Writing Unexpected History for Smart Adults. In her new book, The Dragon from Chicago, The Untold Story of an American Reporter in Nazi Germany, Dr. Toler tells the amazing story of the life and career of Sigrid Schultz. Welcome, Dr. Toler.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
We wanted to jump in. Excuse me, listeners, I have a bit of a cold, so Emily might be doing more of the questions on this episode. But Pamela, we wanted to ask you a little bit about your background. You've talked about your grandmother's stories, biographies of women that you read as a young person, and then how Rudyard Kipling's Kim led you to pursue a PhD in history. We're wondering if you could tell us a little bit about becoming a history buff to the point that you earned a PhD in the field.
Wow. I fell in love, like I said, with Rudyard Kipling's Kim when I was 8 or 9 and just became fascinated by British India. And I was lucky enough in college to have a professor who, in fact, specialized in the South Asian subcontinent. So I was able to really go deep into British history at that point. And by the end of my undergraduate career, I really couldn't imagine not going further in history. And I would, in fact, recommend that if you can imagine not doing it, you should not do it. Because it is long, it is painful, and the job search at the end of it is uncertain at best. But because of that path, I just was fascinated by British India. And then once I finished the PhD, I realized there were a bunch of stories I wanted to tell for people who were interested in more than the 5 people who would be interested in my dissertation topic. I wanted to tell broader stories. And I'd always been interested in women in history. I'd always been interested in the stories that you didn't see all the time. So yeah, in some ways it's been part of who I am my whole life.
Oh, yeah. I love history, but I can only, I guess, digest it in a certain way. And I think the way it's often taught in schools isn't digestible. And I love reading a book like the one you wrote about Sigrid Schultz because it helped me not only understand who this woman was, but I learned history as I was reading it, which I really appreciated.
And that's really important to me. I worked really hard to give the reader a background for, what it was like in Germany during World War I, how the Weimar Republic came about, what the rise of the Nazis looked like. Because Sigrid's story doesn't make a lot of sense without that background. The fact is, most of us don't have a day-by-day, step-by-step feeling for that history. Going into it, I was stunned when I realized how little I actually knew, for instance, about Weimar Germany. So yeah, making that history accessible to a non-specialist audience was incredibly important to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I'm kind of versed in German history, but I didn't know that there was so much street fighting post-World War I, all the way through, obviously, World War II, just from factions fighting after the First World War. So a lot of it, even if you think you know history of this period, I think everyone will learn a lot in this book.
I ended up reading her reporting in chronological order. I literally read every article she had in the Tribune that she had a byline on. So I followed her experience of German history day by day, step by step, almost as if it was in real time. And you get a very different picture that way than you do in your typical high school history class or even college 20th century history class.
Right, and you implied that Sigrid Schultz probably wouldn't have shown up in one of our history books. So let's talk about it. Who is Sigrid Schultz, and why did you choose to write about her?
Well, Sigrid Schultz was the Berlin bureau chief for the Chicago Tribune, 1925 to the beginning of 1941. And at first I was intrigued just because she was a woman doing this. I stumbled across her story entirely by accident. There was a little article that showed up in my newsfeed one morning. This architectural salvage vendor had come across 75 glass plate photographic negatives in the attic of an old house in a North Side Chicago neighborhood. They all had a woman and a small child and a really big dog, and he went to find out who she was, and it turned out the little girl was named Sigrid Schultz. And, the story went on about who her father was. He took the pictures. But then I got to the punchline, which was she grew up to be the Berlin bureau chief and possibly one of the first women to hold that position. I went down a quick rabbit hole just to see if I could find out anything else, and it just became clear. She was one of the first people to tell Americans about how dangerous the Nazis were. She was one of the last reporters to leave while you could still get out. It was such an amazing story. In some ways, it was a very modern story because she was hitting glass ceilings and reporting on fake news, but it also was just such a compelling story and an untold one.
Yeah. There's something you said there that was really compelling to me, which is that she was one of the first women to hold that position. The other thing that I found fascinating as I read the story is that, when people live a long life and it hits a certain part in history, they see a lot of change. I think some people live in a time period where they might not see as much change. But in her career, she was a foreign correspondent when foreign correspondence first became a thing. Mm-hmm. She became a war correspondent, and she became a broadcast journalist. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Part of it is just being at the right place at the right time. World War I really changed the way American newspapers handled foreign news. Before the war, very few papers had foreign correspondents. They just relied on the news services who were there to do exactly that, to give papers back home cutting edge news, but not to do deep analysis. But with the war, once American troops were there, Americans wanted to know what was happening at the front. So American reporters began to go. Some women, though none of them were accredited. But after the war, things had changed. America was a much bigger player in world politics at that point, and Americans had gotten used to reading about foreign news. So a lot of papers decided to set up foreign news bureaus. That really happens in the months after the end of the war. Sigrid ends up being part of that. Her first boss there is the first head of the Chicago Tribune's news bureau. He's actually one of the first American correspondents to show up in Berlin. They meet each other accidentally. She ends up getting the job because she has these extraordinary language skills, which is very rare for the Americans who were showing up. Her boss did not speak German at all. Actually, he claimed he could speak 2 words of German, ein and Bier, which had its value, but did not get him very far in tracking down a story. So she ends up being hired first as a Girl Friday, a translator, a cub reporter. And she ends up several years later being promoted to bureau chief. She goes home in 1941 when it's become too dangerous to stay. She goes back in 1945 as a war correspondent. She had thought she was going to go back after only a couple of months, but she got really sick. There was bad luck. And so she ends up there for the last months of the war. Again, not a lot of women are doing that. About 200 women total were accredited as war correspondents. She's there. She's in her 50s, which means she's not only older than most of the other women, but she's older than most of the men. She's traveling by and large in a skirt, which I just find astonishing. A lot of the women wore slacks. She did not. So she ends up being a war correspondent in her 50s for a brief period of time, does some really powerful reporting, including just some extraordinary reporting from the death camps. She ends up being one of the first women, one of the first reporters, period, to get into the death camps. She's there at Buchenwald only hours after the American troops liberated it. In between those two things, she does become a broadcast journalist. And again, it's really, really new. It's 1939. And at that point, she ends up being a broadcast journalist only months after the first live broadcast was made from Germany to the United States. Because in 1935, it was technically possible to do broadcasts, but there were only 5 receivers available. And the networks here, which were new, they were less than 10 years old at that point, didn't have any sense that they wanted cutting news. What they wanted to come from Europe was cultural events and occasionally speeches by politicians. One really popular one was when they tried to get a nightingale on tape, because nightingales were not native to the United States, and it was believed to be this extraordinary sound. Got a reporter who's there trying to find a way to get a nightingale on tape live. So it's a very new medium, and she gets her chance right before the Munich conference. William Shirer, who was the CBS correspondent in Europe at the time, had arranged to talk to a bunch of journalists from the train platform as they're getting ready to go to Godesberg. And he's catching them on the fly. And Sigrid is one of those people, the only woman in the group. A really new broadcast system called the Mutual Broadcasting System hears her and decides to try to hire her as really a stringer. They're too new to have their own correspondents. So starting with the Munich conference, she ends up reporting for Mutual Broadcasting Service. Munich conference is really a fascinating thing because she's asked to report. She goes in, I think it's at midnight because there's this enormous time difference. And she has to say, I had hoped I'd be able to tell you what was going on here, and I can't do it because the powers have all gone back into conference. It's a closed conference. Nothing's happened. But she's live on the air. So she ends up doing this really funny riff on men liking to have these face-to-face conferences and how every time she hears that, she kind of wonders about it. And then doing a really funny satirical analysis of each of the powers and what they look like and how they're reacting. And then at the end, she does this analysis of why this conference is so important and that it's not really about Czechoslovakia. It's about England and France for the first time having to come face to face with Germany and Italy as powers. And then a few hours later, she's back on the air with breaking news, telling them that in fact, the Munich conference has agreed to give Czechoslovakia, or at least a section of Czechoslovakia, to Germany. You know, it's real news in real time. It's not just new for her, it's new for her readers too. Nobody's heard anything like it before.
Yeah, really fascinating.
Yeah, that was a really fascinating part. And I have to say, like, some of the history I've read about that before is that the Nazis marched into Czechoslovakia and nobody did anything. Well, there was this agreement to give that portion of the country.
Right.
That was news to me about that conference and the decisions that were made. And it's like, okay, well, it's not exactly acceptable by today's standards, but at least now I understand why the world didn't react like we would in different circumstances.
Right, because they weren't actually technically invading Czechoslovakia. They were just marching in. And actually, she rode alongside those troops. That's something that I didn't end up getting in the book. But when they enter Czechoslovakia, she's right there reporting on what it's like and what she's seeing.
Ooh, that's a little Easter egg right there. Is there a particular story that didn't get in the book that you really wish had?
Oh, God, so many.
Too hard of a question?
So many stories. But that one really is a wonderful one because she is driving along beside the troops and she's talking about how they're entering this wooded area and thinking about the role that these dark forests play in German fairy tales, how there's just this fear of going into the deep, dark woods, and yet here they are doing it. And then watching the Czechoslovakian soldiers who are having to turn over their country and the few attempts that she sees of resistance, even though they know it won't do any good. Yeah, that's one of the ones that I really wish I had had room for.
You mentioned that you read all of her bylines in order. You also allude in the book to an unpublished memoir.
Yes.
And did you get to read that, I'm
I got
assuming?
to read that, and it's in pieces. She started it and stopped it a number of times. I was really lucky. She left a lot of material. The Wisconsin Historical Society has most of her material in their archives. Then the Tribune McCormick archives also have a lot of correspondence with and about her. Robert McCormick was the owner and publisher of the Chicago Tribune, and their relationship is very complicated, but there are letters that she is sending him because one of the things he required from his foreign correspondents was that they send him weekly reports about what's happening in their area in addition to their news, so that she's reporting things to him that wouldn't make it into the paper. So that ends up being a really rich source of what's going on and what's happening to her. I mean, that's the source where I get the story about the first time she gets called to the Gestapo, is her reporting on it to McCormick.
I guess I should ask, are you a historian who enjoys what-if questions?
I don't mind them. They are always complicated, and I inevitably will hedge my answers about a great deal, but I am happy to give it a shot.
Okay, so just one of the questions, you brought up McCormick and the fine line that Sigrid had to walk in reporting just to keep the Nazi censors appeased and herself out of harm's way, which is something a lot of other journalists were not able to manage. Yet she was also working for an American newspaper man, McCormick, who was isolationist and anti-Semitic. How do you think Sigrid's career would have panned out differently if she had a different newspaper employer?
I spent a lot of time looking at the two papers that McCormick would have considered his competitors, and that would be the New York Times and the Chicago Daily News. And if she had worked at either of those papers, I think she would have actually had a lot less freedom than she did with Colonel McCormick, because I saw what their foreign correspondents were able to get through. The New York Times was very, very cautious about reporting on German treatment of Jews. And I know less about the Chicago Daily News's stance, but it is clear that they were not publishing the kind of analysis that McCormick allowed her to publish. Now, what would have been really interesting, and I didn't do, would be if I had looked at it's a major paper out of Kansas. The last name of the editor is White. He was sort of the opposite of McCormick in every way it was possible to be. And if she had worked for White, more of her stories about the Nazis probably would have ended up on the front page. She would have been encouraged to not be so careful about isolationism, because White was very much believing that we should intervene. He was not an anti-Semite, or at least no more than 99% of Americans at the time, because it was very common, but at least he was not overtly anti-Semitic. So yeah, she might have been far more noticeable, except the Kansas papers weren't reaching the kind of audience that the Chicago papers were reaching.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Because I know one of the things you mentioned that she knew of, and I think it was 1941 already, was the Nazi eugenics program. And McCormick said he wouldn't run a story about that because no one would believe it.
Right. And he wasn't alone with that. There's a wonderful book, Beyond Belief, The American Press and the Coming of the Holocaust, by Deborah Lipstadt. She just does a fabulous job. And one thing she makes absolutely clear is how many times editors were resisting running stories about the concentration camps, running stories about the laws against the Jews, because not only did they not believe it was true, but they were sure their readers wouldn't believe it. I mean, it's not the best moment in McCormick's treatment of her work, but he's not alone in that. And even when things did get published, frequently people were saying it can't possibly be true.
Well, I mean, even reading your book and getting to the part where there are reporters at the concentration camps, it's hard to believe that it's true.
Yeah.
Knowing that it's true, right?
Knowing that it's true. It's just so astonishing. At least one of the reporters who was there with Sigrid was so concerned about being taken in. There had been reports of German atrocities in the First World War, atrocities in Belgium, that Americans and everybody else had reported as if it were God's own truth, that in fact turned out to be fake news. This woman was so determined that she not be taken in, that she really was very harsh in her questioning of the prisoners in the camp. And later, when she realized it was absolutely all real, retroactively expressed her shame at how she treated them.
Yeah. In your media kit for the book, you write, "Today we face an alarming upsurge in the spread of misinformation and attempts by powerful figures to discredit facts so they can seize control of our political and cultural narratives." What do you think is the best way to support journalists and news sources today?
For one thing, buy newspapers. If they don't have the ability to pay reporters, they don't get the news. It's hard as the consumers of the news to do more than to be sure that newspapers exist, that radio stations exist, that NPR exists. But it also means being a cautious consumer, spending the time when it doesn't sound quite right to check, trying to get your news from more than one source. No matter which side of the divide you're on, you probably should be listening to at least some people from the other side of the divide so you know what they're hearing. Making sure you are actually a consumer and then being an informed consumer. Because I do feel strongly that the best defense for democracy is an engaged press.
Yeah.
Great point. It's interesting. I was just talking to friends this weekend about, what papers to subscribe to. And a lot of people forget to support their local papers, and that there's a move to support your local papers, but also the difference between having an online subscription and a paper subscription.
Right.
And that online, the headlines are built as clickbait, whereas when you get a paper, there is a way that the paper is designed to have things laid out so that you're reading things chronologically that makes sense as you go through the paper. And I thought that was a really good point and made me want to, subscribe to paper copies of every newspaper.
Well, and sometimes you learn things from where the stories are in the paper as well. And how a paper gets laid out is a way of telling you which stories the paper thinks are important. Some of Sigrid's really important stories ran on the entertainment page, which meant they were there, but you only saw it if you were the kind of person who read your paper cover to cover. Otherwise, if you read the front page and you read the headlines, and I must admit, I've only got one paper that I get in paper form. I have 3 or 4 that I get online, and it's really easy to just read the headline and the little clip and then not open and read the rest of the way down.
Yes.
Yeah. I enjoyed learning too about one of Sigrid's techniques on getting some of the dicier news out, and that was to bury it in the middle of an article. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. It's built on the idea that most people only read the top little bits so that it's less apt to get caught by a censor. It's less apt to get caught even by a German official in the United States who is reading the papers for things that are detrimental to Germany. And that happened more than censorship at the front end. They tended to censor you retroactively, at least in print journalism. Obviously, they couldn't do that with radio. So that by doing that, she's getting stuff out that otherwise might not. I mean, her first report on the concentration camps, for instance, is that way. And it shows up only a couple of months after Hitler took power. So she starts out with an article about how they raided Einstein's summer home because they'd been told there were dangerous weapons there. And then there's a piece about the concentration camp. And then it ends with more about the raid on Einstein's summer home. So it's hidden there in the middle.
Yeah.
Of course, the other thing with that is it means that only the really careful readers see
Right.
the important stuff.
The people who really want to be informed
Right.
and have good attention spans.
Right.
Well, Pamela, we've kept you a long time. Before we let you go, would you be willing to tell us what you're working on now?
I wish I could, but I don't know. At this point, I'm flailing around in the weeds looking for stuff. Though I think it's a good bet that it will be a strong woman whose story has been underreported.
I mean, it's pretty miraculous how you came across information about Sigrid. So I think, if you're just out there reading your architectural newsletters and things that come into your inbox, something will show up. We can't wait.
I can't either.
This was such a fascinating read. Thank you so much.
I'm delighted I had the chance to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Pamela. This is fabulous.
Yeah, this was such an exciting and interesting read. And I did both. I listened to the audiobook, which was really well done.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, obviously I didn't read that, right. But they always give me an opportunity to help choose the narrator, and it's tricky to find the right voices.
Yeah.
Yes.
Did the person that you suggest, is that the one that they ended up using?
Yeah.
Nice. That's lovely.
Yeah. Good. And I think she did a great job.
Yeah, she did. She made it very compelling. I have to say one follow-up, it's not really a question, it was just something that I really enjoyed, was how Sigrid and her mother, Hedwig, hosted baked bean parties in order to make friends with people, friends in high places that served her well in the future. I thought that was really brilliant.
Well, and we forget how hungry people still were. Being able to get good food at their house was not a small item.
That's a really good point.
Oh my gosh. Well, she was her language skills were off the charts. And then she was such a good strategist. And she also had such, I think, profound emotional intelligence in dealing with people. And then back to looking at the news, she had such depth of knowledge, like having Goring over at her home for meals after they'd met at a restaurant a couple times. So she knew this man. So then at the end of the war, when they had captured him and he was trying to downplay things, Sigrid was there to say, that's not what you were saying back then. And I think having that longevity for history and then for justice, well, justice and then history, I suppose, is the way it should go.
Yeah, and that made her really unusual at the time because, for the most part, people got moved around. But she was there. She was the solid points in the Tribune web.
Yeah, it makes me think we need more of that in our own lives.
Well, but it makes you wonder with the way reporters are now. I mean, I guess that's the point of what I was trying to get to with that question is she lived in a period in time where she grew into being that kind of a reporter. And now I feel like from some of the people we've talked to who are in the newspaper industry, they're being forced to write clickbaity things to keep people reading and buying the paper. That makes it hard for them to do the job they want to do now.
Well, and the foreign correspondent, people are often sent to places where they don't speak the language.
Right.
Obviously that happened in the mid-20th century also. She was unusual in that she did.
Yeah.
I just can't imagine having to be totally and completely reliant on translators.
Yes, that's a really good point.
Yeah. On the other hand, the number of Americans who speak, say, Arabic is relatively small.
Yes, it's true. It's true. One last thing, and this was just something that made me a little bit sad, but maybe I interpret it incorrectly. In the epilogue, when you talk about even to the day that she died, in her obituary, she wanted to be referred to as a newspaper man and not a newspaper woman, yet she wore skirts instead of slacks.
Sure. Part of it was that there was value to being one of the boys at some level, and she was very willing to work both sides of that fence, both occasionally doing the, "Why, sir, I don't know what you're talking about," kind of thing, but at the same time needing to be one of the boys to be taken seriously. But also there was a tendency when they talked about newspaper women at the time, often there was some feeling that they might be using their feminine wiles and sexuality to gain access. Being described as a newspaper woman at the time made you less serious. And for her, it was important that she be taken seriously.
Yeah, that just made me think of something I wanted to ask, and that was Catherine Ann Porter referred to Sigrid as a Nazi honeypot.
I know.
I mean, she didn't mean that as a compliment and part of her strategy, did she? Was that more of an insult?
No. That was definitely an insult. Okay. And Catherine Ann Porter's own biographer just says she just took a dislike to Sigrid. And she evidently behaved badly during her brief period in Berlin and had a lot of peculiar opinions.
As we know, women can often be hardest on each other, which
Absolutely.
Is sad. So, Okay, we've kept you far past the hour we were supposed to. Thank you so much. Obviously, we could talk to you about this for a long time. Well, we're sorry if you're feeling like you haven't figured out what to write next, but we know it'll come, and we'll be excitedly waiting. No pressure at all.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Book Cougars with Chris Wallach and Emily Fine. We'll be back again with another episode in 2 weeks. Until then, come chat with us on social media, Goodreads, or email us at bookcougars@gmail.com. If you'd like to help support our podcast, please tell others about us, leave a review wherever you listen, and consider becoming a patron. Even $1 a month is a big help. Learn more about that on our website, bookcougars.com, where you'll find the show notes for this and all of our past episodes.
Thanks, everybody.
This episode was edited by Pat Keogh Sound Design.